Yeah.
So shall we go ahead and get started?
Okay, on that note.
On that note.
On the party note, right? The party. I want to welcome everyone. It seems like people are still coming on from, I guess, from the previous address, but let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome the audience and my beautiful panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your time to continue this forward-looking conversation about race. How does space and place matter? Black Lives Matter protests are spanning the globe, and they demand we define new urban possibilities and potentialities, and that's what we're here to do today. The Possessive Investment in Whiteness has been published 3 times in 20 years. In the latest edition, George Lipsitz laments he would rather that the conditions he originally described would no longer exist and that his book be obsolete. I imagine W.B. Du Bois would share the same feeling about his analysis of race and space, which he published in 1899 as the Philadelphia Negro. Questions about space, race, and place are what originally drew this panel together. We recognize the legacy of Du Bois and the Chicago School have gained renewed attention, but American sociologists have focused for too long on US cities. As our current pandemic indicates, we are very clearly part of a bigger world on the move. I'm very happy that our panelists today are sharing an awareness of the ways urban areas connect our global existence. Today, we hope to move forward in thinking about urban life by promoting an interactive panel discussion and conversation with the audience. Attendees will notice that the chat has been disabled. We encourage you to use the Q&A function to post questions, consolidate related ones, and upvote the ones you want answered. Use your vote. Let me start with an outline of our agenda. First, an introduction of to the panelists. Then I ask each panelist to keep their preliminary comments to under 10 minutes in order to maximize our time for collective engagement. Each panelist will then have another 5-minute opportunity to address the panel in no particular order. After this, we will start our Q&A, which I've charged the audience with helping to facilitate. Finally, each panelist will have 5 minutes for concluding thoughts. So to begin with brief introductions. There we go, okay. George Lipsitz is Research Professor Emeritus of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His single-authored books include The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, How Racism Takes Place, A Life in the Struggle, Time Passages, Footsteps in the Dark, The Hidden Histories of Popular Music, Dangerous Crossroads, Popular Music, Postmodernism, and the Poetics of Place, Midnight at the Barrel House, The Johnny Otis Story, A Rainbow at Midnight, Labor and Culture in the 1940s, and The Sidewalks of St. Louis. He published Insubordinate Spaces, Improvisation and Accompaniment for Social Justice with Barbara Tomlinson, and The Fierce Urgency of Now, Improvisation, Rights, and the Ethics of Co-Creation with Daniel Fishlin and A.J. Hebney. He co-edited Seeing Race Again, Countering Colorblindness Across the Disciplines. Lipsitz serves as chair of the board of directors of the African American Policy Forum. He was awarded the American Studies Association's Angela Y. Davis Prize for Public Scholarship in 2013, and its Bode Pearson Prize for Career Distinction in 2016. Harvey Mollich is Professor Emeritus of Sociology both at NYU and the University of California, Santa Barbara. His first book was about place and race, Managed Integration, Dilemmas of Doing Good in the City, was written from the concerns of the day about racial change in Chicago. It argued neighborhood integration efforts of the time were plagued by racist disruptions of real estate markets, and that the then practiced integration efforts would only exacerbate the underlying problem of racist market making. His projects since then have been more general treatments of land use markets and contrast of use and exchange values, such as Urban Fortunes, The Political Economy of Place with John Logan. His most recent book, The New Arab Urban, Gulf Cities of Wealth, Ambition, and Distress, is relevant to global structures that impact property development and sort groups according to economic and ethnic categories. His other works include His other books include Against Security, Where Stuff Comes From, Building Rules with Key Warner, and Impacts of Growth with Richard Applebaum. He also co-edited Toilet, Public Restrooms, and the Politics of Sharing with Laura Noren. His most recent American Sociological Association award was a W.E.B. Du Bois Award for Career of Distinguished Scholarship in 2019. Other ASA Lifetime Achievement Awards were for his career in urban sociology and his career in the sociology of environment and technology. Zaire Dinzey-Flores is an associate professor of sociology and Latino and Caribbean studies at Rutgers University. Her book, Locked In, Locked Out, Gated Communities in a Puerto Rican City, won the 2014 Robert E. Park Prize for Best Book in Urban and Community Sociology. It investigates how race and class inequality is negotiated and codified in the architecture and community gates of public housing and private subdivisions. Her current work focuses on race, housing, and neighborhood design in the United States and the Caribbean. She is a member of the Afro-Latino Forum and a founding member of the Black Latinas No Collective. Dr. Dinzey-Flores also served as a mayoral appointed board member for the New York City Housing Authority. Abdul Malik Simone is a senior professorial fellow at the University of Sheffield and holds research associations with institutes in Germany, Jakarta, and Indonesia. His publications include Improvised Lives, Rhythms of Endurance in an Urban South Africa, Always Something Else, Urban Asia and Africa as Experiment, New Urban World, Inhabiting Dissonant Times, Jakarta, Drawing the City Near, The Social Infrastructure of City Life in Contemporary Africa, City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, Movements at the Crossroads, For the City Yet to Come, Urban Change in 4 African Cities, and In Whose Image, Political Islam and Urban Practices in Sudan. He also co-edited Urban Africa, Changing Contours of Survival in the City, Rogue Urbanism, Emergent African Cities, and Urban Imaginaries, Locating the Modern City. He has partnered with research institutes in South Africa, India, Jakarta, and Lagos. I'm so very happy that you're all here to share the results of your work with us. So George, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, it's a great honor to be here. Pleasure to be with everyone. We have important work to do. It's no secret that across continents and countries, I'm going to start my slideshow here. There we go. That spatial fixes serve as instruments of power. They're a key part of the oppressor's toolkit. That basically using spatial regulation as a way of instantiating divisions of race, class, gender, coloniality is a constant throughout the last 1,000 years. And one of the points of origin is the enclosures of the commons. That what this did in 13th century England was to take public land and make it private. It was one of the first schemes of privatization. And the word privatization has within it a relationship to the word deprive, that the purpose of enclosing the commons was to change land from being a public resource to be shared into a private investment to be hoarded. And in the process, it criminalized the poverty. It criminalized the subsistence and survival strategies of working people, forced them off the land. It also criminalized hospitality. One of the things that the enclosures did was that you couldn't help somebody else who was desperate and who had been displaced. And so the regimes of displacement, dispossession, dehumanization that we see today have always had a spatial component. And this also, closing the commons produced the extractionism that environmentalists and especially indigenous people have been pointing out today, the idea of the land as something to be plundered rather than to be lived with in harmony. Spatial fixes as instruments of power include, of course, empire, include the plantation, both as a regulatory space for labor, but also as a profit-generating source for capital, vagrancy and loitering laws, which make the policing of place and the taxing of time an instrument of class and racial power. And these produced what we know of as these things that make race and place go together: the ghetto, the barrio, the reservation. But these things get enacted in new ways every day. Malcolm X used to say that racism is like a Cadillac, they make a new model every year. And so, as if this long history of the spatialization of race wasn't enough, we have new forms being created: the common interest development in the suburbs, the tax increment financing zone in the inner city, the urban development and redevelopment. All of these are spatial fixes for problems of plutocrats, and it's the way that they enforce, maintain power, and increase inequality and injustice. We certainly see extractive policing and debt collection, which is a useful thing today. Today is August 9th. We're 6 years to the day after the killing of Michael Brown on Canfield Drive in Ferguson, and the insurgency that erupted in response to that. The people of Ferguson took to the streets, the very streets where they had been stopped, searched, disrespected, humiliated, and criminalized simply for their identities. If you had a non-gender conforming identity, if you appeared to be a Black male involved in Black culture, if you appeared to be a working person who couldn't afford to renew your parking sticker or your occupancy permit, basically the police used spatial control as a way of dominating the population. And of course, the murder of Michael Brown, alleged for manner of walking in roadway, allegedly for jaywalking, is a dramatic illustration of that. Leaving his body in the street for 4 hours was a spatial performance designed to tell everybody within sight that this could be you. And so the people took to the streets themselves. And when they yelled, "Whose streets? Our streets," they were resisting the constant policing of public order, as not only as a way of creating inequality, but as imposing limitations on how people can be in the world. And so when Reverend Sekou and others on the streets of Ferguson said they were out there not just to mourn Michael Brown, but to live how you want to live, dress how you want to dress, wear what you want to wear, and love who you want to love, they're talking about space as a node in a network of regulation. So even before the bullets hit the body of Michael Brown, space and race were conflated. You see on the left the artificial barrier created between the city of Ferguson and the suburb of Kinloch. These barriers also existed to keep Southeast Ferguson, a place where people live in mostly Section 8 voucher housing, apart from the downtown of Ferguson. There's almost no way to walk there without jaywalking, which then gets you arrested, but also the use of so-called quality of life crimes in public disorder, as a way to fuel the city and to subsidize the property tax breaks that are given to homeowners and to businesses, but to make up for them with fines, fees, and debts imposed on Black working people. So Emerson Electric is a Fortune 500 company located in Ferguson. It pays about $68,000 a year in property taxes. On the right, you see citizens of Ferguson who's contributed about $3 million a year in revenue to the city of Ferguson for the fines that they incur for alleged traffic violations, for wearing saggy pants, for having their music too high, for not cleaning up leaf debris. In the nearby suburb of Pagedale, a 60-year-old woman was fined and arrested for not painting her back door. This is a form of extraction that is made possible by the racialization of space and the spatialization of race. But we shouldn't see these things as uncontested. I work with groups around the US, and I know the other scholars on this panel work with groups around the world, where property outlaws are creating spaces of resistance. They're creating alternative spatial imaginaries that have within them a democratic possibility for the future. So the Community Land Trust in East LA is trying to take speculation out of the housing market by buying property and administering it in a collectively accountable democratic way. The Freedom Foundations in New Orleans are trying to use the settlement one of them got from being falsely imprisoned for 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. Instead of using that settlement for himself, he's using it to build a residential youth mentoring center in which returning ex-offenders will be connected to vulnerable youth in the community. The Commonwealth Project in St. Louis is a group of artists, academic, and activists who are working with the Equal Opportunity Housing Council in St. Louis to deal with the way in which the mostly Black suburb of Centerville, Illinois, gets flooded with sewage every time it rains, while there are bastions of resorts hoarding and opportunity hoarding all around them. Finally, the Hampton Ade Flowerman Garden in Houston, done by Project Row Houses, creates a place marker for the Third Ward in Houston, which is not about redevelopment, but what is about traditions of struggle. Carl Hampton, Black activist murdered by the Houston police in 1970, Ayanna Ade, a midwife in the neighborhood, and Cleveland Flowerman Turner, who was an artist and grew plants and created community gardens as a site of new sociality. So the spatial fixes are instruments of power, they're instruments of domination, but like all instruments of power, they can be turned around. Hegemony can be turned on its head, and if the organization of space oppresses us, then activity in space is one of the ways to end that oppression. Thank you.
All right, Harvey?
Yeah. Hi there. Hi there, everyone. That was something. So I'd like to thank you, Nicole, in particular, because I was staring at a blank page, and Nicole came up with solutions. And she's a great organizer, and I tip my hat if I ever, I don't have a hat, but if I did, I would tip it. And thank you, George, and no thank you, George, because George said so much that was substantively rich that I could go home, except I can't because I am home. So that's another problem. I see it to just put some of the things that George said, as well as our general panel into a very large context, which is that there's a sort of double phenomenon going on, often kind of put as binary, and that is between flows and process and meandering or something like that on the one hand, and structures and stoppages on the other, and durables, the creation of things like durable that are quasi-permanent. And that set of intellectual issues has been, I think, addressed in various times in peoples, and also subject to a debate, which I think can be, in a way, I'm not interested in the debate because some things can be both. And the challenge for sociology is to work out what it means for something to be both. So how can there be continuous dynamism and flows on the one hand, and yet there is structure, fixity, as George uses that word, stoppages together. And I think that Zaire, her work, gates. Gates are a way in the physical world to deal with both fixity on the one hand and fluidity on the other, but of course ceding control to specific individuals or institutions or organizations. And that's an example of how flows and structures can be seen in a kind of dynamic way. So there are leaks, entropies, disorders, of which in a way George was talking about in the last phase of his conversation, and also something that we were talking about before this group got together, and that is when public, that is, and that is germs, which is another very dynamic and disorderly phenomenon that is not human constructed, and something like climate change, which is human constructed, but then has an autonomous existence quite apart from any of the other things that humans do or might ever do, as it sometimes happens. So I see the history of the world, and this is kind of compatible with George, is a fight for fixedness. And that, but more general than George put it. So a fight against entropy, tombstones, is a kind of a micro placed effort to create permanence and fixedness at the extremely micro level against fighting against something which we know is inevitable and is flowish. It's a losing battle, but it's a battle that, at least in some cultures like our own, we allegedly solve with marble, the most enduring possible, or granite. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory. And the tombstone is a way to start. The gates, which of course, as we also know from the scholarship, is not just physical, but is also legal and structural and attitudinal. And that's another way in which it's dealt with. Markets and misleadingly, market language speaks of market settlements. And that's wrong. Because there are not settlements. It is a constantly evolving dynamic force, including through continuous adjustment of the rigging of the market. And economic sociology has done its share to destabilize this idea of settlement. And to bring back or insinuate rigging, not in the Trumpian terms, but in sociological terms, that make settlement very misleading, both because it's rigged and because it's temporary. And the rigging needs to be constantly readdressed. As indeed racism, which is, as George knows extremely well, and that kind of sorting is a kind of handy and I would say pathetic solution to the dilemma of impermanence and needing to have something be permanent. And color, skin color, is a handy way of beginning that process, along with the great historical modalities of that kind of settlement. And of course, that one is more than tombstones, is dangerous because it's done oblivious to the large-scale injustice that it creates. And there was that phrase: "If you're white, you're right. If you're black, get back. If you're brown, stick around." Those have a physical dimension to them. They're emplacements. So in terms of this dilemma of place versus space, that kind of phraseology, I think, gets at it. So one of the things that was put on my agenda is to talk about, and I'm just going to do it for a minute, this more recent project that I was part of that resulted in this book called The New Arab Urban, which is actually a compendium of essays by colleagues active in the region and its scholarship. One of the striking things about the new Arab urban, which is the United Emirates, the UAE, etc., because it's a little bit more complicated than that. But these are my co-editor and I, Davide Panzini, an Italian scholar, regard these as enacted societies. And so the kind of evolving collective endeavors and these efforts to insinuate fixity, which accumulate over generations for other societies, are sort of, it's like a microwave. It's like an instant hot. These are societies created over an extremely short period of time to fix into being nations, great cities, all sorts of institutional arrangements, really out of the blue. I think, I know nothing like it in history. And what it does do is reveal how those processes work in history through slow motion. And this is on speed dial. And we get to see how it is that that nation and city and the distinctions of what race means can be almost instantly set up, and the institutional mechanisms that do that. And they don't go to script, including the fact that they are so instant. That's not in script. And the other is that who is subjugated and who isn't is not on script. So the, quote, indigenous people of the area are actually the extremely rich and the top dogs, and particularly privileged, even compared to white male Europeans. And that's, that shows what can be done through rich dictatorships. And it's at least worthy, it's, I think, more than a footnote to how history works and what in the so-called globalism that we now have, what it might portend for other rich elites in terms of how to make things happen. One final note, and again, George got at it, which is that any structure needs constant attendant. Every gate needs to be oiled. And so it is that the nice quote that George cited, which is that a new model Cadillac has to be constantly, that reminded me of Richard Pryor, but I know it wasn't him. It was Malcolm X. Has to be constantly made up. And that is, in a way, the dynamism of the way class and race, and some would argue, everything works. That is, we have an ongoing handy inducement for attentiveness in the way that actor network theory would imply. That is, any structure has to be constantly attended to, and privilege is a great motivator and organizing of attending. That piece is missing from Bruno Latour, traditionally, at least in his setup of the work. So race and wealth have built-in allies, attendance of privileging structure, and I see that as an intrinsic aspect of the dynamism of that fixity. Thanks.
Thanks, Harvey. Excited?
Okay, so thank you, Nicole, for organizing this panel. I'm very happy to be here and with such admired colleagues. I am going to make up for my short professional bio relative to my panelists with perhaps a longer intervention. And Nicole, you've asked us to speak in more dialogical ways, and so I'm centering my comments on the questions posed in the panel's title: where, how do space and place matter? And while true that the very foundations of US sociology, as exemplified by Du Bois' Philadelphia Negro Center geography, location, space, place, the terms we use to call it, though the specifics of what we refer to when we talk about what place, space means remain a big question, and one I think it's worth seriously taking up. I'd suggest that in US sociology, space has become mostly an effort to understand relative location, where one is geographically relative to others. And this is a very general assessment. Surely there are exceptions. In my work, I focus on space in a quite specific, but also in a multiply loaded way. I specifically use the terms built environment, and I've been playing with this, maybe thinking about built habitats, but I'm thinking. But built environment has become a more or less common term 20 years ago, which is not that long, but long enough. When I started to do this, I got a lot of questions about what that meant when I would use it. And I subscribe to that facile definition that comes from contrasting it to the natural environment, built environment, as human being. Though events like Katrina in New Orleans or Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, or even the earthquakes that are hitting the southern part of Puerto Rico currently beg the question of whether any of our environments are not human, or at least inflected by humans, which might make them, many of them, all built. But back to how I'm thinking of the built environment as multiply loaded, it includes a Euclidean notion of space that highlights its geometric qualities, but also an aesthetic artifact, design, architectural qualities, color, form. It's also a cultural container and tool of culture, and also an infrastructural and structuring structure, to use Bourdieu's term, and structured structure of power, which of course insinuates David Harvey, Lefebvre, Tom Gearing, and as well as all of my esteemed panelists. Structuring structure that organizes practices and the perception of practices, but also a structured structure. I really like that phrasing used by Bourdieu. But I say that Du Bois' treatment in Philadelphia Negro, at least empirically, insinuated many of these elements. But sociology, in my assessment, has largely kept location and done away with much of the rest. In my work, I have examined the built object of gates, as Harvey pointed out, in gated communities to understand how they are both reflect and refract the social. They are product and producer of the social. Central to building the new world, this is not something that's new. The very genesis of the post-Columbian Americas came with a firm understanding that the new world had to reflect the old world and produce its societies. For example, the Spanish law of the Indies in the beginning of the 16th century, which is the first really urban plan in the Americas, at least post-Columbian, made it clear to colonizers that the towns of the New World should be built behind 4 protective walls, each with a guarded entrance to protect from impending attacks from the sea. But threats to colonies did not only come from outside. How European empires would build cities, towns, buildings, and homes in the Americas was meant to guarantee and secure their mercantilist accumulation of wealth, whether by protecting from outside or disciplining and controlling inside. So like the peripheral town walls to defend from outside, colonizers fortified all the internal buildings and sites. For example, the law of the Indies instructed settlers to, quote, with greatest possible haste, erect jointly some kind of palisade or dig a ditch around the main plaza so that Indians cannot do them harm, end of quote. So even homes were fortified. For example, in the law of the Indies, it stated, quote, all town homes are to be so planned that they can serve as a defense or fortress against those who might attempt to create disturbances or occupy the town, end of quote. So gates, fences, and walls are mere examples of how built environments not only maintain, but are tasked in maintaining inequality both physically and symbolically. Partially resolve this question, I think, or attends to this question of fixity and fluidity that Harvey was pointing on, which engages the meaning with the durability, a durability that's changing but durable in the physical. And we can look to how all built environments in some way achieve this. I, for example, really like Foucault's speaking of how punishment is impressed in the city, and it's one of my favorite quotes, quote, "This then is how one must imagine the punitive city at the crossroads, in the gardens, at the site of roads being repaired or bridges built, in workshops open to all, in depth of minds that may be visited, will be hundreds of tiny theaters of punishment," end of quote. And so these physical environments are not only physical, right, but are legible and filled with meaning. They constitute public images, to use urban planner Kevin Lynch words. And the form itself plays a tremendous role in the shaping of the image, he contends. And they distribute power. They warn and discipline city navigators and shape race, class, and gender inequality and exclusion, and multiple types of exclusion. So to take up race specifically, we have to think about the built environment always being racialized, always a product and producer of racism and the white logics and power that dictated its production. That's why I go back to the law of the Indies in the colonial enterprise. It serves, if you will, inequality, and not the other way around. Surely gated communities display this racializing power from golfing communities throughout the world. Also, shout out to the book by Hugo Cerón on golfing in Mexico, which points to this, to the work by Melissa Valle on gentrification in Cartagena, Colombia, to the work on women and housing in Brazil by Keisha Camperi, to the work of Brandy Summers on Black aesthetics in DC, to the work just out by Joana Londoño on the way in which Latina barrios have been brokered for consumption, to the work of Amanda Boston on Brooklyn racial capitalist aesthetics. They're all doing this work, as well as the seasoned scholars of my fellow panelists, as well as those who have honed in on space as a racial matter, Mary Patillo, Catherine McKittrick, Simone Brown, Kianga Yamata Taylor, and Diane Harris. And speaking of Taylor, McKittrick, and Harris in particular, I want to highlight not only that which we consider public space in this conversation, but also that which we consider private space. And this attends a little bit to what George presented about the transformation of space into private property. So as the 16th century law of the Indies lay bare outside and inside, those spaces that were considered public, but also those that are considered domestic, private, quote unquote, are central objects of racializing practices. And in some ways they weave the two, right? They connect the two. Of racializing practices, white supremacy and capital accumulation. So they work in concert, in collaboration with the public, as they become more than indicators of aesthetic preferences, but perfect reflections, or maybe they're imperfect, but they are reflections of the production of aesthetic markets that reinforce inequality. So my current work, focusing on real estate markets, displays this, but goes further into the spaces that are often considered intimate. By focusing on real estate listings and the way in which homes and neighborhoods are prepared and advertised to be sold, and are staged and shown to be sold for maximum revenue, I try to understand the power of a system that trains every spatial environment to enforce racial inequality. And it doesn't do it alone. Obviously, there are actors, right, doing this. There are attendants, as Harvey puts it. I argue that these properties and neighborhoods are discursively and physically staged, produced and marketed in ways that white out unpalatable, and by unpalatable, I mean both aesthetically unpleasing, but also economically deleterious qualities. These qualities are not only racialized, but they make space racial, and they infuse value into certain race-based aesthetics and lifestyles, which in turn reproduces inequality by tightly connecting symbolic and material value. I'm thinking here of things that visually and textually inhabit listings and the imagination of what a good property and a good neighborhood is, which also insinuates a safe, a valuable, but I'd also say white neighborhood, which is the unspoken term, as the work of Maria Christian et al. Has shown. So I'm thinking here things like granite countertops, kitchen islands, brownstones, tree-lined blocks, open plans, safe neighborhood. I often quote the example of a woman selling her home being asked to remove not only personal elements of life, but those elements that specifically pointed to Black history and politics, because it could affect the selling price of her Brooklyn home by up to $200,000. Or the example of attracting buyers and renters to a neighborhood by relying on colonizing discourses to quote unquote go native, not only recycling symbolic associations, but building and cementing literally by destroying and undoing, and at other times fighting to preserve the racialized qualities of landscapes, homescapes that make them materially valuable. One important dimension of this is what Harris calls the power of landscapes to hide in plain sight, making racism really effective in these veiled features. This is akin to the types of racism circulated not only in the US, but throughout the Americas, and particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. This quote unquote unconscious racism that is hard to find and locate is why I focus on gates and these types of environments in urban policies in my work, because they veil racism very effectively by placing the conversation on what appears to be aesthetic preferences, but that really recall racist formulations. I'll make one more point, well, a couple more points. In working with a predominantly Black neighborhood and a Latino neighborhood in Brooklyn in my current work, Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, this work also focuses the real estate products as the cross-section of race and ethnicity, teasing out how ethnic commodities are elaborated in sync interrelatedly, but also distinctly from racial commodities. Bushwick, a neighborhood where many Latinos identify as Black, offers an insight to the ways ethnicity and race are parsed out in the US as market commodities, which has also been an element of marking and making racialized space. For the Latino element, the work of Latino Space by Arlinda Avila is instructive. And this puts what has often been treated as separate in dialogue, Black, Latino. I'll make a last quick point that we may choose to discuss more later regarding considering the epistemologies of seeing and living race and how we encounter space, particularly where arguments are made that they don't exist. And this requires a conversation about methods and who sees what and why they see what. Positionality is centrally in question here. So that I saw race in the gates has to do with going through processes of being excluded or surveilled in the processes of those gates operating. And that I see the Black Latino juncture in looking at Bed-Stuy and Bushwick in Brooklyn has to do with me being a Black Latina. And so we must speak not only of that, but also what seeing dominant normative, how we see dominant normative built environments or habituses. And by that, I also mean policies and planning efforts as already racial spaces, right? From the point of genesis of the Americas, modern Americas in the latte Indies. And we have to consider what arguments and what methods and what evidence are deemed valid and rigorous to display that. That's a whole other but important lane of this conversation, I think, in considering a sociology that is intersectional, historical, and responsible to account for the ways in which spaces are racialized. I think of McKittrick's work on Black geographies may be instructional here, but I'm pushing for more. I'm thinking of the way sociological studies about residential choice, gentrification, and other miss these links. There's a way in which hemispheric and global connections are missed, to think of how Puerto Rico matters as much to US urban sociology, or Cartagena, or Rio, as Chicago or New York, if we think of the genesis of racialized space in the law of the Indies, or of racial experience in the US, starting in Florida, never being disconnected from the Caribbean or Latin America. So thinking of America, not just America, as US. And thinking of Blackness and whiteness as embodied, made material and symbolic and part of the everyday throughout. And also thinking these are not strictly US phenomena. And I know the weight of empirical specificity that as sociologists we are under. I know that that's a reality, perhaps how we are distinguish ourselves disciplinarily, but I'd argue that there is room to embrace more complete conversations. Thus we end up as ultra-provincial, which I don't wanna be, but also a provincial sociology straight up excludes people like me and whatever we may add to our knowledges. And in essence, recycles the very dominant normative whiteness that we see in the built habitus I'm trying here to outline. I'll stop there, my comments.
Thank you very much, Saide. All right, Abdul Malik. I might not be unmuted. I'm sorry. I said thank you very much, Saide. Abdul Malik, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm trying to share my screen. Let's see, why isn't it working?
George, Nathan, any ideas? I think you should see it at the bottom, no? I highlighted in green. At the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I know, but I have it on desktop and it's not showing up.
If it's a PowerPoint, I had that experience recently. Just take it away from the slideshow and then try sharing that and then putting it as presentation.
Doesn't seem to work though. Because usually you just could go to desktop and you have it. So
you can try closing it and opening it again. I had the same issue recently.
okay.
I had to move mine from desktop over back into a regular file. It didn't work on desktop for me either.
Okay, I guess it's not going to work.
Another option is if you want to email it to me, then I can share my screen and you can talk over whatever slides you have.
Okay. Let me do that.
Nicole? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yep.
You might want to use this time to ask if there are questions from the audience that are aimed at one of the presenters, so we could get that agenda going.
Fantastic. All right, attendees, if you want to post your questions and answers, I see that Cynthia Zhang has posted questions for Harvey and for Saida. For Harvey, could you please explain race and class are allies? For Saida, could you please explain how space is important for domestics? Thanks.
Were there those two questions, or?
Right, one for Harvey and one for Saida. So for Harvey, could you please explain race and class are allies? You must have said that?
Yeah. Race and class, what I meant to say is that race and class as something that is durable have allies in that they're both different kinds of privilege and linked, of course. And so those who gain privilege from race or from class are the ones who will attend. There'll be attendance, a co-attendance to maintaining those phenomena as durable, and give them ways to recover from processes of disorder or entropy, constantly serving as attendants for their durability. That's what I meant to get across.
Okay, thanks. Saida, can you please explain how space is important for domestics?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think typically, especially when we're thinking of sociology, we resort to think about public space, right, or spaces that are shared. Well, that are shared in non-intimate settings. And so, the work I'm doing now with real estate and looking at real estate listings specifically, and looking at the ways in which there is not only aesthetic, which I argue are not simply aesthetic, right? They're material and interested preferences that are made of or demanded of intimate spaces, like how many bathrooms, or whether you have a kitchen island or a countertop. But those are regulated. They're also regulated, and they're not only regulated formally, right? By if you ever you have to get a building permit, and you have to provide plans, and you have to get approvals. But they are also regulated by our sense of what is beautiful and what is desirable and what makes up something valuable. And I'm materially valuable, not only symbolically valuable. So these spaces are also part of this conversation, right? These domestic spaces, especially when you're thinking of real estate markets, they shape and they inform the qualities that will be, that are sellable, that will bring in the money, that will add value to your home. So in that way, they capture racial histories. They demand a certain aesthetic that generally benefits those who have been the winners, right? Or the privilege in the situation. So my argument is that these are also spaces that we should be paying attention to, and that they connect, right, with public spaces. Certainly in real estate listings and advertisements, we can look to the way they connect homes to the street and to the neighborhood, so that they exist in that context. And so there is a continuity there being elaborated that I think is important to focus on the domestic as well.
Okay.
And not to say, I mean, there's other like Dolores Hayden who have focused on the gendered aspects of, of the design of homes. So this is in that vein, but also kind of thinking very intentionally about its public dimensions.
Okay, thank you, Zaire. I have the PowerPoint, so let's go ahead and get to that. All right. Can you see what I see, Abdul Malik? You're muted.
Yeah, if you could go to the first slide, please.
Okay, here we are.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you for I'm sorry for this, this glitch.
It happens. We're adjusting to the new normal, no?
Yeah, and thank you for, as the only one wearing a hat, I have to really tip it to all the other panelists for basically, I don't have very much to add. Okay, so the conundrum that Du Bois has provoked in the one of the founding works of urban sociology over a century ago, and which has haunted urban work ever since, is basically how to think about the ways in which macro structures of power, how they attribute and enforce specific meanings to the practices of spatial production that are deployed by different versions of the majority. And I mean different versions of the majority, meaning the majority not necessarily as a statistical entity, but as those residents of the urban who do not fall under clear sense of who they are. Sometimes it can be the marginal, sometimes it can be the working and lower classes, the poor, but the majority being in some ways an aggregation of those whose efforts to create moments and experiences of residence are not fully valorized, or they're deprived of the tools through which to valorize their own experience. So in some sense, that kind of tension between the attributions of specific meanings of spatial production and the real composition and implications of those practices on the formation of collective life and the territories of its operations. And here I'm talking about territories of operations in a way which doesn't map on exactly to the notions of place. Territories that are always being composed and recomposed, that don't necessarily have any fixed geographical emplacement, but rather become modalities of operation that enable residents, enable the majority, particular kinds of opportunities for endurance and also self-constitution. And this is a kind of tension. This is a kind of tension that has persisted over time, basically for the reasons that Harvey has already articulated, in that what is fixed always needs to be attended to, and what is fluid and what is in some ways mobile always needs some kind of infrastructure in which to articulate and recognize itself. And so this is an ongoing conundrum, an ongoing tension within the kinds of relationships between the power is something that is imposed and power is something that is in some sense self-constituted. So Nicole, could we go to the second slide? I mean, in the regions, in the metropolitan regions in which I have been working over the last 15 years in South Asia and Southeast Asia, in what we can generally call as sort of popular economies, that value was not generated so much by making things, but rather in the use of relations themselves as a kind of resource. And the way in which those relations could be recombined in ways that constantly change what anything might mean, might count for, or be used for at a particular time. So residents often initiated particular kinds of activities, such as making markets, improving the built environment, managing festivals, undertaking small entrepreneurial activities, not only as a kind of production for its own sake, but a way of signaling, a way of conveying, a way of making visible the willingness to explore collaborations that went beyond the function of these activities themselves. So it was possible for particular kinds of residents to be identified with particular kinds of activities. But this was, in some sense, a kind of limiting process. It was a kind of strategic process, because all of those activities through which particular residents might be identified could always be exceeding of that. It always had a kind of communicational value, which said, I'm positing this, I'm doing this, I'm identifying this, not to be fixed, not to be tied down, but to enter into the possibility of different kinds of arrangements through which these kinds of activities might have a different kind of value by being involved and associated with what you, my fellow residents, might be doing. So the third slide, Nicole, if you will. Now increasingly these practices of value formation of popular economies are increasingly being expropriated as platforms for a kind of intricate constant rearrangement of urban metropolitan power, where in some sense the state itself, the metropolitan state itself, rather than consolidating itself within a particular kind of identifiable form, which it continues to do. I'm not saying that it doesn't continue to operate through things like metropolitan governments, private-public partnerships, a whole array of different kinds of institutional structures which are identifiable, which are consolidated, but rather also that the metropolitan state itself is redistributed through a vast kind of network of different kinds of actors, different kinds of activities, which depend upon, in some sense, the interconnection between various criminal circuits, between different kinds of actors, different kinds of spaces, different kinds of scales, that constantly remake itself. And in some ways, expropriating the very kinds of logics, the very kinds of initiatives, the very kinds of modalities of value formation that have been long embodied by the very majority, which now becomes folded into a kind of mirroring of their processes of everyday life, but now in some ways converted and reconverted into the basis by which metropolitan power itself reconfigures itself. And always based on a kind of an ongoing economy of the fungibility of what bodies can do. Monetizing contingency, speeding up circulation time. But the important thing, once again, is that the kinds of logics that were inherent within the plantation system on the fungibility. What is it that bodies can do? How can you make bodies do something beyond what the sort of normative standardized version of it is? Now is incorporated in not necessarily a kind of plantation logic, but a plantation that perhaps is distributed across very different kinds of temporalities, different kinds of manifestations that become sutured together as a kind of oftentimes claustrophobic apparatus in terms of running metropolitan spaces. Next slide, please, Nicole. So in cities where livelihoods have been predicated on the capacity of individuals to become many different things for many different people, Neferti Tadiar, in a series of incredibly insightful writings, talks about the way in which lifetimes, everyday lifetimes, become increasingly derivative and are lived almost as financial derivatives. That is, in some sense, where the fungibility of identity becomes much more important than how identity is fixed within particular kinds of narratives. It doesn't mean that that such fungibility is liberatory. It doesn't mean that in some sense it is at all emancipatory at all. But in some sense, the stake that that bodies can be moved around to see what happens to them at different moments. They're expendable, they're evictable, they're killable, but it doesn't mean that they don't matter. But that they matter, how they matter, is completely a kind of arbitrary calculation based on what it is that they could possibly do on certain circumstances. But in mattering, the constitution of the mattering is taken out of the hands of those that are supposedly matter themselves. And of course, as we all well know, that urban renewal and development has always speculated on the extent to which certain bodies could be moved, enrolled, and deployed at an affordable price. And then the final slide, Nicole, if you will. So what I'm trying to get at here is that increasingly within urban analysis, within sort of urban geographies, there is increasing attention to the notion of the surrounds, the urban surrounds. And this surrounds is, in some sense, not necessarily the hinterland or the periphery, but at moments it could be. It's not the kind of interstitial space between the urban and the rural, but it could be. But rather the surrounds as being, in a way, that aspect of the urban, which is both the manifestation of an intensified unsettlement, the particular disposition of an unsettling process, and the particular modes through which particular kinds of bodies and residents inhabit the urban as something that is not settled. And so in some sense, the surrounds is not a specific place, but as I said, it could be. It's not something separated out from the urban, but it could be. So it has a lot to do with the kinds of rhythms and the temporalities through which the unsettlement process takes place. Not something beyond control, but could be. And here I have in some way in mind, J. Cameron Carter's project on the Black outdoors as something which in some sense are those spaces of unruliness, unfixity, undefinition, the inability for something to be specified within the confines of particular kinds of apparatuses and regimes of control. And in some sense, the surrounds becomes increasingly important as particularly within the metropolitan regions that I work in, as increasingly residents are let go and are letting go of particular kinds of emplacements. They are let go from any kind of ongoing investment in the kinds of built environments, in the kinds of built material conditions that would enable a kind of ongoing endurance of particular versions of the majority in place. But at the same time, the majorities, different versions of the majority itself, are letting go of specific places as manifestations of their own assessment of a kind of ongoingness, of a kind of collective endurance. And even at moments where they express a great deal of commitment and satisfaction in what it is that they have created, they are letting go of particular places because they no longer see those places and their position within them as sufficiently strategic in terms of what is necessary in order to inhabit an urban condition which they don't know exactly what is. And so it's not that they're letting go in order to resituate themselves in other parts of the urban, not to invest in a kind of ongoing life in a particular kind of destination. Although they might say there's an aspiration to resettle and to be settled somewhere in which the kinds of values, the kinds of aspirations they might have might be manifested. But for now, and for a now which is in some sense being increasingly elongated, a kind of elongated temporality of the now, what is being instead valued is the importance of circulation. And circulation that might be done by individual bodies and residents, or circulation in the way in which the fundamental social arrangements, the fundamental infrastructures of care are being distributed across multiple kinds of sites within urban regions, where families, extended families, kinship systems, friendship networks are being increasingly spread out in order as a kind of heuristic arrangement to see what kinds of opportunities are out there and what are the best kinds of ways of acting and speaking and organizing oneself that might take advantage of these kinds of opportunities. So in a way, when I talk about the surrounds, it is this, in some sense, this kind of suturing together of different kinds of places to configure a kind of territories of operation that might at the moment constitute passageways, conduits, underground railroads, ways of dealing with things that in some sense operate between the notion of spatial control and the undoing of particular ways of inhabiting space. And undoing in the sense that Saidiya Hartman uses in her kind of feminist aesthetics of undoing, where undoing is as important as in some sense making. And so undoing becomes a kind of political technology in this moment of unsettling. And so in some sense, when this goes back to the kind of problematic that Du Bois has identified, and many others with their rich work over the past century, of how one thinks about the kind of real of the majority, the real of their practices, and the kinds of powerful meanings that are attributed to them, and how one thinks about the ways in which these kinds of relationships are continuously struggled and reworked and reconfigured. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we want to take some time for the panelists to address the panel with very rich, thoughts and insights about the urban and relationships and, fixity and flows. I really appreciate everybody's comments, but I'd like to hear from the panelists in no particular order. What comes up for you as a result of these conversations?
So could I get in, because I have something to respond to Abdul Malik, and thank you. This idea of the surrounds, but also there's in a way micro surrounds of routings. That is the pathway. You use the term railroad, and to push it. It's like a world of railroadness, that it's a constant kind of movement, kind of tubes, which in a way have their own durability and fixedness as these mutual adaptations take place. I don't know if that's really true, but to a degree it's true. But I'm Du Bois, since that's the person. Du Bois, of course, is most famous for the idea of double consciousness. And in a way, when I took in Du Bois, I thought also of multiple consciousness. That is, for black, white in the United States, double, it seems to me, works well. In other cultures and places, it's triple or it's N. And that's what your conversation just now brought to my mind, that it's not about double. It becomes cognitively more complex than double. And I wondered what you might think of that. I mean, for some people, double lives on. So I heard a talk recently of Puerto Ricans who are from Puerto Rico but live in Miami and maintain a continuing relationship. And that's a kind of doubleness as well. But what I think what you're proposing is a broader, a larger N. And how does that work?
I'd like to give the other panelists a chance to raise their questions before we start the back and forth on question and answer. George or Saide?
Yeah, well, there's so much to say, and this has been a really rich conversation. Thanks to everybody for what you're saying, and more than we can comment on now. The one hook that struck me again and again was that, you know, we both believe in place and we don't. We think in order for class and racial formation to take place, it takes places. The gates are oiled in specific circumstances, specific modalities of operation, specific theaters of punishment. And yet we inherit a history of place, which is a kind of nostalgia, rootedness, a belief that certain people belong to certain places, an idea that movement is always negative and is displacement and dispossession. And so much of the scholarship that Zaire mentioned from women of color, especially Melissa Valle, Arlene Davila, I think of Michelle Tejas, her notion of transfronteriza. They're basically talking about the ways in which the cognitive mappings of power are also creating other cognitive mappings, some of which burrow into specific places, but others assume a constant movement, a kind of unsettlement and unexpectedness, as we've been saying. And so, as with race, we often say it's everything and it's nothing. The same thing with place, you know, that things do. Emplacement is a technology of power. But on the other hand, we're not looking for a rooted, fixed home in which people would return to places. Capital has made that impossible. And in its own interest, it's created this kind of unexpectedness and movement. And the question is, how do aggrieved communities and oppressed communities live with that? And how do they take the knowledge that they have of that, which actually puts them far ahead the people who, as Abdul Malik have said, think they own the places in which they live, but they've also given up on them in many ways.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question for all, and thinking of more precisely also Abdul Malik's presentation of the surrounds. And my question is about aesthetics, like where do they fit in and how do you see them informing these power dynamics?
So it looks like it's on you, Abdul Malik.
But what's on me?
I think that there's the Q&A also wants to know more about the surrounds and popular economy practices. Harvey, what was your question? It was about the micro surrounds?
Well, maybe two things. One is, how big is the N? That is, how much consciousness can we live in? And do we? And do these surrounds become rootings which themselves have a quasi-permanence, the railroad metaphor?
Thank you.
May I expand, because I want to make sure that I'm also talking about aesthetics. It was a quick question, but it's a serious question about whether the form matters here. what does the form bring into this conversation for the surrounds? Because potentially when people are disrupting or challenging or maybe just going about their days and redesigning or reinforcing, how it look kind of recall or challenge, or, you know, and I thought about the undoing of the monuments, right? Or replacing of monuments and those sorts of strategies. But maybe even it could be, you know, street vendors and putting in different smells or different into the environment. How does that also kind of create possibilities to challenge or, you know, redefine built environments?
Absolutely.
I mean, let me try to do both. I mean, the short answer to Harvey's question is that the N in some ways is necessarily multiplied as the spaces of inhabitation become much more dispersed. You know, where if you lived a long time in a particular neighborhood, even though you might wear different hats to different people, you still were like Harvey, the guy who could do this and that and known in a particular way and have a particular kind of status, and you consolidated your life in relationship to a kind of steady cast of characters in a particular neighborhood with particular kinds of aesthetic features and ways of looking at things and possibilities of witnessing and everyday transactions and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that while that still persists for many in very significant ways that we shouldn't forget, this dispersal also takes place and shapes and occupies an urban landscape which is increasingly all over the place. That is, you don't know quite whether or not it's coming or going. That is, within the kinds of extended peripheries of many regions, which could be the surrounds, you find a kind of intensive contiguity of different built environments that almost have nothing to do with each other. They're just simply in a kind of physical contiguity, but the kinds of interrelationships amongst them, you'd be hard pressed to easily draw lines amongst them. But what's interesting is that they oftentimes take a very generic form. You know, you need affordable housing, build, 5,000 units, they all look the same, 90 miles from the urban core. They all look the same. Now, while we would assume that this has a kind of homogenizing impact upon those that live there, in actuality, we don't know. In actuality, we don't exactly know how they're used. We don't know what's up with the person living in the 1,500th, 40 square meter pavilion unit. We don't know. Unlike the neighborhood that you come from, where we all know Harvey, and he's always at this cafe on the corner, and he's always going to like church at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We don't have a clear idea about how these things are inhabited. It may be that it's the most banal kind of inhabitation. It might be warehousing populations that are being extruded from every other place in the city, but it's not clear. And that lack of clearness, that aesthetic, that kind of aesthetic of a kind of homogeneous looking space provides, in some sense, a kind of important piece to these kinds of territories of operation. They're not the destination that anyone wants to end up for sure. And in most instances, they're not the territories of they're not the places of destination that people, these are provisional places where people park themselves for a particular reason so that they can have some place to put an aged grandmother, and then they themselves are moving on somewhere. So in some sense it is, and if you look at Delhi, look at Calcutta, look at Jakarta, look at Saigon, their peripheries, you look at the industrial states, you look at the mega towers, you look at the affordable housing, you look at the migrant hostels. They all have a kind of sense of being half full and half empty. You don't know if they work or not. You don't know, it's hard to tell whether or not these places are viable or not. the glass half full, half empty? How do you tell? But yet there's a kind of conviction that at some point they'll become something. So in some ways, that end, the end of different kinds of modalities of self-consideration, self-identification, its relationship to particular built environments and their aesthetic features, you know, we can no longer, with the kinds of surveillance apparatuses, the kind of track and trace kinds of apparatuses that seem to be useless for Corona, but in some ways are able to identify particular bodies that have been conceded, that have been let go. You let go. You don't socialize them. You don't fix them. You just let them fend for themselves as they can, but you can track them. I don't think we have the luxury of being able to have this notion that for every singular identity, we need a niche aesthetics, which identifies fully the kinds of values and aspirations they embody. So I'm not afraid of the kind of generic city. So in this way, the multiplicity of forms of subjectification, the aesthetics of the built environment, its materiality, and its particular oscillating location constitutes a kind of what I'm trying to talk about, the surround.
Well, I have a question for the panel. I mean, I appreciate, Abdul Malik, that you said you're not afraid of the generic city, but I kind of want to return to George Lipset's comments when he is sort of portraying the street, the sidewalk, as a place for, what did you call it? The visibility, the performance of violence. It seems to me that, it seems to me that the panel has done a really good job of thinking about, you know, flows and fixity and the expansion of the surrounds and aesthetics. But I would like for us to think a little bit more about how this surveillance happens. You called it, you called it, we let people go, right? We let it go, but we want to be able to track them. How this tracking gets expanded.
Yeah, well, I think, again, it's this both and rather than either or. My colleague Avery Gordon says when the state abandons you, it never leaves you alone. So there's a way in which things are unregulated and unexpected, and there are unsettlements. And on the other hand, there's the most cruel and brutal theaters of punishment that we talked about earlier. And so, and in some ways, both are true. Yes, those streets in Ferguson were a site of incredible humiliation and disrespect. People turned them into a site of affirmation, of mutuality, solidarity. They had a different idea of development. It wasn't developing the business community of Ferguson. It was developing their relations, you know, with each other. And there, the cultural things that Zaire talks about are tremendously important. That part of the reason why they were able to fight against the police and mobilize in the way they did was that they had been running hip-hop raves at places where they had to escape the police, and they did this dance with them, and there was no final victory, there was no final settlement in this. And so I think it's a both and rather than an either or. And in some ways, you know, the grandiose dreams of power are presented to us as if they were social reality. Part of what, again, what Professor Dinzey-Flores says to us is that our epistemologies in some ways block us from seeing the way life is actually lived and how people are actually governed.
Yeah, I think that piece of I think that piece that you remind us, George, about epistemology and the ability to see is sort of also what I think Abdul Malik is making a methodological push to not assume, but to really try and understand and see how spaces are built. And it reminds me of this sort of aggressive, violent architecture, right? I mean, the Mike Davis sort of anti-homeless benches, but in Dominican Republic, they built these highways where vendors started to protect themselves from the sun by setting up shop under the highways, right? Like and what they did is they built pyramids then to counteract, to push them back out of those spaces. So while I think that there is a need to investigate and think about how people sort of move through these generic and standardized and, you know, infrastructure, I also am not ready to kind of relinquish the power that those have. And so when thinking of the law of the Indies, and you know, you go throughout Latin America and you see that every town has a plaza, right? Wherever the Spanish set foot, the plaza was dictated by these urban plans. And in many ways, right, like those explicit kind of relationships that were to be sustained, hierarchical, power, abusive, violent relationships that were to be sustained between the indigenous and the Spanish were formalized in that very durable, that to this day we have. Sure, the plaza has become kind of a site of where people hang out, and it's celebrated now by many Latin American and Caribbean cities as part of the culture. But it also, and in my book I talk about this, it also kind of exposes people to policing practices. It also, especially that those don't have access to private, right, like socializing spaces. So the question here is, how do we keep that tension? Because at times I think the plaza let's do away with the plaza, right? Like this romantic notion of what it does, it also comes from a very violent process of production. And maybe this is what you're talking about. Maybe this is the surround that you're talking about, right?
It's like kids in Asia who watch so many like narco movies. Within their own vernaculars, they talk about the need to have a plaza. Now, you know, the plaza for the narco is like to have a piece of territory from which you distribute things from. You know, it's not that you consolidate things in place. You're consolidating things in place to distribute. But in the Asian version, the plaza is a kind of you try to consolidate something from which to move from. It's a temporary thing. The plaza may move, you know, next week, in 2 months, but the plaza becomes a kind of launching pad, becomes a kind of logistical operation through which, so although I agree with you entirely, we have to keep that kind of tension. We have to also look at the ways in which, you know, these kinds of notions can be sort of deterritorialized and remade in different kinds of strategic ways.
So speaking about deterritorialized, the audience has a question. How do you envision the virtual spaces inhabited online, such as social media platforms, et cetera, and their relationship to race and power? Are these platforms a site of resistance to racism and oppression? Or do they create a disembodiment that erases the race, gender, class dimensions of individual users? Is this disembodiment an equalizer among users, or does it reinforce privilege?
I think all of the above.
Yeah, I would second that. You know, there would not have been the first Ferguson insurgency if it weren't for Black Twitter. It wasn't the preachers or the politicians or the professors who responded to Michael Brown being killed. It was Black youth on Black Twitter. On the other hand, and Twitter was an important way to mobilize in space. It's not either or, that people were actually able to use it as a strategic tool, as Yarimar Bonilla and John Rosa and others have pointed out. On the other hand, you have people making Twitter reputations online as Ferguson activists who actually have no constituency in Ferguson and did no actual work within Ferguson. And even people at the moment when police are coming, giving away important information, because even though it'll be devastating to the people massed on the ground, it adds to their brand. And so I think, as with everything we've been talking about, it's both and rather than either or. If you grab a knife by the handle, you can cut your bread with it. If you grab the knife by the blade, then you only hurt yourself.
I think I have.
that,
Okay. You.
no, I think that, yeah, just to echo that. But one important thing, I think, coming back to Zaire as well, is that in the context in which I've worked in, I mean, What's Up has been a very critical way of mobilizing attention, mobilizing interest. But it also becomes a way in which people get bogged down because most of people get their news from What's Up. And so What's Up just floods the field with so much different kinds of information and perspectives that people spend a lot of time trying to figure out what it is that's real or not. And those kinds of questions were always, in some sense, deliberated in person. You know, like the barber shop or the quilting circle or the church. People use their ongoing live social transactions as a way to figure out what was to be real for them or not. But in this kind of proliferation of What's Up, who knows, you know? And so there becomes almost a cultivated indifference to whether something is real or not, you know? And that becomes, to me, a kind of danger in terms of the use of the virtual world.
Yeah. I'll provide a little bit of an example from the research that I'm doing with real estate listings, because there they are using virtual staging, right? So in essence, a place becomes inhabited, right? Like becomes through these fake, you know, fake furniture and fake, I mean, they're real, but they're not, right? But the interesting thing is that they use the same, like you could go over listing and many listings that use the same aesthetic, the same look, the same sofa, the same, right? And I think that points to a little bit to the reproduction, the way in which it can open, right? Like it can become broader, but it can also become narrower, right? So reality can also become misrepresented as being a lot more narrow than it is. And so I think power also feeds off of, you know, of the recycling, like one story. So, and I think much of social media also works like that, like one story gets pulled in, right? And that is the one that, like, you know, goes viral. And then that becomes the story, right? What's valuable? Having a white sofa. You know, who knew that would increase the value, right? And then that feeds material inequality in very serious ways.
It seems like we're talking about new pathways or new railroads, as Harvey called them, for the commodification of life and aesthetics.
Yeah, and they're, well, I don't know this, well, yes. They become Instacartized, and there's all kinds of things are being standardized so that the sort of the chaos of goods of the marketplace, including foods. When you're buying on Instacart, it becomes white sofas. There's very standardized products that you return to again and again, thanks to our friends at Amazon. So that's when I said all of the above, because that's one of the mechanisms of standardization, including of product and goods, and enclosures as to what can now get on the market. Barriers to entry, as the economists say, have become very codified in ways they didn't used to be when physical presence was a part of the deal.
And I think that sort of leaves us with the current moment, right? Obviously, internationally, we recognize now this sort of new normal where we increasingly mediate our social relationships with one another online, whether it be WhatsApp, whether it be Twitter, whether it be Zoom. So I appreciate all of you for sharing this, great conversation with us. The conversation is going to be also shared on YouTube, so people will be free to comment there as well. And I'll be in touch with you all about, what we've talked about today and how to move that conversation forward. I'm really grateful for everything that we've shared and thought about together today.
Thank you, and props to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Really
Yeah.
good.
Stay well, okay, everyone?
Yes,
Yeah.
stay healthy,
Yeah.
even, albeit a little bored.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you,
Bye.
Nicole.
I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
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 Bye, Harvey.
Bye-bye.